This is Stone Cold Export, and today we are testing which CPU is best for high refresh rate gaming. So the CPUs for testing today is the AMD Ryzen R5 600 XT and the Intel Core i5 10600K. The i5 is overclocked to 5 GHz with 4266 MHz CL16 memory, because when we are aiming for high FPS, memory also comes into play along with CPU and obviously the GPU. The R5 3600 XT is left at stock speeds because that gave the best gaming performance, and it got 3800 MHz CL15 memory because going above 3800 MHz results in a performance loss on 3rd gen Ryzen. The GPU used today is the Gigabyte Aorus RX 5700 XT, and we are only testing at 1080p. I've tested 8 different games. There are no RPG games tested because I think high refresh rate is mostly an advantage in first-person shooter games and racing games. But I also tested Dota 2 because it's also a very competitive title. For the test, we tried to hit 144 frames per second for the average, the 1% and the 0.1% low. Now you might have a hard time noticing dips below 144 frames per second on a display with FreeSync or G-Sync, but in this test we assume you're not using these technologies. Now let's get to the results. We start off with Assetto Corsa Competitzione. This is the only racing game in this test, and the performance between the Ryzen R5 3600 XT and the Core i5 10600K is very similar in this title. The R5 3600 XT drops slightly below 144 frames per second with the 0.1% low, but still delivers excellent performance for a high refresh rate display with the 1% low at 145.9 frames per second on average. The R5 3600 XT will deliver very smooth performance for a high refresh rate display, but the Core i5 10600K is slightly faster, although I doubt you will be able to tell the difference between the performance of the two CPUs in this title. Now let's move on to our first-person shooter game, Battlefield 4. Yes, 4, not 5. Had some issues with Origin and BF5, so 4 will have to do for this test, and in my opinion it's the more enjoyable game. But here the R5 3600 XT is able to deliver over 144 frames per second on average, but the frame times is not able to keep up, with the 0.1% low actually dipping below 100 frames per second. The i5 10600K is 12% faster for the average frame rate, but the frame time is 21% faster for the 1% low and 27% faster for the 0.1% low. This means the i5 would deliver a better experience on a high refresh rate display, such as a 144Hz or even a 165Hz display in this case, but it still fails to deliver over 144 frames per second for the 0.1% low, but it does get closer to the target than the R5 3600 XT. Next game is The Division 2, and we did not use the built-in benchmark, but actual gameplay for this benchmark. The R5 3600 XT managed 192.5 frames per second on average, which is well above the 144 frames per second target that we are aiming for in this round of test. But the 1% and 0.1% low does fail to meet the 144 frames per second target, with the 0.1% low again dipping below 100 frames per second. The i5 10600K is 9% faster for the average frame rate, which isn't all that important when we are already at 192.5 frames per second on average with the R5 3600 XT. What's more important is the frame times, and the i5 10600K is able to keep the 1% low very close to the 144 frames per second target, and that is a 13% lead over the 3600 XT. The 0.1% low does dip quite a bit below 144 frames per second, but is 16% ahead of the R5 3600 XT, which means the i5 does deliver a better overall experience in this title as well. Now let's move on to Dota 2. In Dota 2, the R5 3600 XT is pushing 195.1 frames per second on average, which is well above our 144 frames per second target. Again though, the 1% low does come in below our target, but 121 frames per second is not bad, but it's not able to keep up with a 144Hz monitor. The 1% low is all the way down to 69 frames per second, which is not great. The Intel i5 10600K is doing a lot better in this title, with the average frame rate coming in at 246.1 frames per second average, 26% ahead of the 3600 XT, and able to keep up with a 144Hz monitor or even a 240Hz monitor. The i5 is also able to keep the 1% low above 144 frames per second at 149 frames per second, which is 23% ahead of the R5 3600 XT. The 2.1% low does dip quite low on the Intel as well, but at 77.9 frames per second, it's still above the result for the 3600 XT. Now let's move on to the next title, which is Fortnite. In Fortnite, the R5 3600 XT is able to push 279.5 frames per second on average, which is well above our target 144 frames per second, and it's actually enough for a 240Hz monitor. The frame times are also quite good, with the 1% low staying well above 144 frames per second, but the 0.1% low is dipping down to 127.2 frames per second, which is, it's not bad, but it's still a bit lower than our target 144 frames per second. The 10600K is 17% faster for the average frame rate, which isn't all that important again, because we are already at 279.5 frames per second with the 3600 XT. What's more important is frame times at this point, and here the i5 excels. With the 1% low staying above 200 frames per second, it ends up being 27% ahead of the 3600 XT. One could argue that even that isn't all that important, since the 3600 XT is already able to keep up with the 165Hz monitor, but the 10600K comes close to keeping up with the 240Hz monitor, which is a very good result. The 0.1% low is just a hair under 144 frames per second on the i5, and that means it's 13% ahead of the R5 3600 XT and will be a smoother experience on the 144Hz monitor without FreeSync or G-Sync. A strong result from both CPUs, but the i5 still has the edge with the frame times. Let's see if the next title can change that, which is Call of Duty Warzone. The R5 3600 XT comes in at 186.3 frames per second on average, well above our target. The 1% low is also able to keep up with our target and comes in at 147 frames per second. The 0.1% low dips slightly below at 138.2 frames per second, but this is still a strong result. The 10600K is 5% faster for the average frame rate here, but this is down to 2% for the 1% low, and 0.1% low is actually 5% slower or behind the R5 3600 results. In this title, these CPUs are so close to each other that you will probably not be able to tell one from the other. Let's move on to Rainbow Six Siege. In Rainbow Six Siege, we do a terrorist hunt on the house map, and we do this 5 times, discarding the best and worst result and averaging the remaining 3. This is actually done for all the tests, but I felt it was important to emphasize it here. So the R5 3600 XT comes in at 304.8 frames per second on average. The 3600 XT doesn't seem to have any problem succeeding 144 frames per second on average in most titles, but the frame times are usually where it falls apart. Not here though, with very strong results for both the 1% and 0.1% low, staying well above our target 144 frames per second. This performance would actually be perfectly smooth even on a 165Hz monitor, and wouldn't be too bad on a 240Hz one either. The i5 10600K is 3% ahead for the average frame rate, again not terribly important when we are already above 300 frames per second. The 1% low is also 3% better on the i5, but the 0.1% low is about 17% behind the R5 3600 XT. It still clears our 144 frames per second target by a wide margin though. Overall, a win for the AMD CPU in this title, but this could be due to the slightly better multi-core performance of the 3600 XT and how well Rainbow Six Siege handles multi-core CPUs. Although again, on a 144Hz monitor, you probably won't be able to tell the difference between the two CPUs in this title. Last game is a fairly recent one, Valorant. Here both CPUs deliver incredibly strong performance, with the i5 coming in 8% ahead for the average frames per second. Although I would argue that it doesn't matter at these frame rates. The 1% low is 9% faster on the i5 10600K, and the 0.1% low is 5% faster, but again we are talking about some very strong performance, and these differences doesn't make that much of a difference at this point. The R5 3600 is already capable of keeping up with a 240Hz monitor, so both CPUs passed this test with flying colors. The verdict though is that the Intel Core i5 10600K is better suited for high refresh rate displays, and the R5 3600 XT isn't really worth the price. If you want high refresh rates on a fairly low budget, a regular R5 3600 should be able to almost match the R5 3600 XT's results for a much lower price. But the Intel Core i5-10600K is the best choice for competitive gamers using 144Hz or higher displays. My advice though, if you are aiming for high FPS, is to tune your memory. Regardless if you are on AMD or Intel, it really does make a difference and can give you a slight edge in those frame times. That's all from me for now. Thank you so much for watching. I gotta get back to the GT3 race now, so farewell.